Good afternoon, folks. Robert Chappell, Executive Editor of Madison365 with your daily update for today, which is Tuesday, November 16th. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get to my interview with Madison Police Chief Shon Barnes. The Madison Police Department today released a report that they commissioned from the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice, which is connected to the University of Pennsylvania Law School. And we'll have a chat with him about that. I'm going to have a story of the Channel 3000 recap of that press conference is up at Madison365.org right now. I'm going to have a more detailed analysis of it tomorrow morning for you. But in the meantime, we're going to talk with Chief Barnes and get his kind of chief takeaways, as well as John Hallway, who is the director of the Quattrone Center. So we'll have that after the break. But first, let's talk COVID for a minute. We will get through this quickly, I hope. The numbers today look, a few of these numbers look pretty similar to yesterday. You might remember yesterday the percentage of positive tests, meaning in the past 7 days, all the tests that were run in the state of Wisconsin, 10.8% were positive. That number has been revised upward to 11%. And today is 10.8%, which means like today is 10.8%, but actually is better than yesterday, which turns out to have been 11%, which is, it's just catastrophically bad. It's just, there's not enough testing happening. Today also, we have the most new cases in one day since December, 3,981 new cases. The last time we had over 3,900 was December 10th or something. It's crazy. That puts our 7-day average at 2,953, which is about 100 more than yesterday, I think. Nice little jump from yesterday. So, yeah. Yes, 2863, so 90. The average went up by 90, which is kind of a significant jump. We're still at 14 new deaths per day, which is not as bad as I would expect given the other numbers. Again, though, these are deaths that occurred probably 6 to 8 weeks ago, and they're just now getting reported, or confirmed, rather. When someone passes away, there's a whole process that goes on where the coroner makes the determination, the medical examiner makes a determination as to the cause of death, and then that gets uploaded and put into a statewide database. It just takes time. So these 14 new deaths per day are just new deaths that are being confirmed today, not that are happening today. We have 22 new confirmed deaths yesterday, which keeps our daily average at 14. Now, I would expect that to continue to rise a little bit. I honestly, given the numbers even 2 months ago, I expected us to be in the 30s by now, and we're not. And there's probably a number of factors for that we don't need to get into. But if there's any silver lining here, it's that we're having this sort of big surge in cases, big surge in positive test rate, and is, at least as far as we can tell now, not causing as much death as it did last year. It is causing a lot of hospitalization, not as much as last year, but 1,144 people hospitalized. That's the highest number of the current surge. We kind of peaked at about 1,100 about 2 months ago, and then we've been going down since, and now we're back on the rise. That's about a 10% increase in the past week. 322 people currently hospitalized in intensive care units. Statewide, there are only 64 intensive care beds available. Which means that, less than 5% of intensive care unit beds are currently available in the entire state of Wisconsin. Now, those aren't all occupied by COVID patients, obviously. They're also heart attack patients, cancer patients, people coming out of surgery, that kind of stuff. But the fact is that COVID is straining resources, and there's just no way around that. Okay, so that's the gist of the COVID numbers. We talked yesterday a little bit about the disparity between vaccinated and unvaccinated. I've got an article, a story on that. I got some graphs so you can kind of visually see that up on the website at Madison365.org right now. All right, so we are going to take a short pause. We'll come back after this, and we'll talk a little bit more about this report that comes from the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice right after this. So stay tuned. Don't go away. It's a good interview. All right, so this report was originally going to be about something else. This is a federal grant that the police department got in 2019, and they were going to examine it's basically just a quality improvement idea, that they would look at a sentinel event, that's the official word they use, a sentinel event, and sort of examine how the police did. Originally it was going to be the Shake the Lake event. And they're going to look back on that, talk to stakeholders, talk to officers, etc., just to get an outside perspective on how they're doing. After everything happened last year, they decided to change direction and look at the 2020 protests instead. So this is the results of that. It was a long process. They talked to a lot of people, looked at a lot of documents, a lot of video, and I got to speak with Chief Barnes and the executive director of the Quattrone Center. And here's my conversation with them. And joining us today are Madison Police Chief Shon Barnes, and from the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice, I think I said that right, John Holloway. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen. How are you doing today?
Great, thanks. Doing well, thank you.
Good. So we're here to talk about this report, which was commissioned by your predecessor, Chief Barnes, right, to examine the police department's response to the civil unrest, to the protests that happened over the course of 2020, and just looking back on those. And it's a big report. It has 69 recommendations, which I think, Dr. Holloway, you earlier today were very cautious to say recommendations are not criticisms necessarily, right? But just recommendations. So we don't have time to talk through all 69 recommendations, but Chief Barnes, can you just talk through some of the themes, some of the high points, some of the things that kind of stick out to you that you take out of this report?
Sure. Some of the things that are key takeaways are communication along the lines of preparation, also communicating with stakeholders, people who are involved before, during, and after protests. Another key takeaway is training and equipment, ensuring that the officers are trained properly, that they have a fully understanding of the protest, and that we have the equipment that we need. And then another big piece, obviously, is trust and legitimacy, which is very important as we try to determine how to prevent these things from happening before. The communication piece, I really take that to heart, because I think that whenever you have a law enforcement presence doing a demonstration, especially one that's aimed at the police, anything you do will be looked at critically, as it should, and then having the ability to explain why we're doing certain things. We're not talking about strategy or tactics, but we're talking about why did we make this move to move these people this way when everyone thought it was the right way to go. It could have been a danger that was unforeseen. It could have been a significant arrest of someone who was seeking to disrupt the peaceful protests, and trying to give that thorough information to our community. Equipment is important, because how are you going to do that? You can't yell, and
right.
Sometimes the standard bullhorn may not be appropriate. And also using our community members to help us with getting the message out too, using community dialogue representatives as we did toward the latter end of the protest. So, this document really is an evolution, I think, of our department within about 180 days.
Right. Well, that's what's interesting about it. It's not just looking at one event. It's looking at the late May protests, which they'll remember, all the way up through the protests at the end of August. And one of the things that this report notes is that your tactics and the way you dealt with folks changed over that period of time. Right, Dr. Holloway, maybe you could talk to that and how you what you saw, how you saw the interactions evolve over the course of the summer.
Yeah, so one of the things that was really interesting about this process was seeing that evolution and being able to compare and contrast how different things that the department did had different impact as the protesters and the police were sort of reacting to one another over the course of the summer, because of course things the protesters were doing changed as well. And so the stakeholder group had an opportunity to observe that and to factor those things into some of the recommendations we made. So it became clear, for example, that particularly when police are the focus of the protest, when the chief talked about legitimacy, and I think a big part of these protests was the community saying, we no longer think that policing in the United States has the legitimacy that it needs to have. When the police are then the focus of that protest, to then have displays of sort of crowd control that gets viewed as an inflammatory thing. So the fixed lines that police were using at the beginning of the protest, which was a very standard way to respond to protests that were becoming disruptive and violent, I think the department realized relatively quickly that those fixed lines were creating more problems than they were solving. And they began looking for other ways to interact with the crowds that would still allow them to provide physical safety for the protesters, but wouldn't do so in a way that would escalate tensions. And so you saw more mobile responses and fewer of these kind of, these lines that would say, the community may not pass here. And so that was an example of an evolved tactic that I think was a very beneficial one that the department did really on its own and on the fly as the protests were progressing.
Yeah, and also those fixed lines. Having been there covering those fixed lines were not just fixed lines of officers, but they had riot shields or whatever. They looked sort of military-like, so and very intimidating. But you note that there was one particular moment when a leader of one of those groups of law enforcement officers took off his gas mask and approached the crowd and kind of humanized himself. Does that make sense? Is that something that a recommendation possibly?
Yeah, very much so. And what's interesting is when you speak to people who were on, in the early days, you talk about how the protective gear itself is viewed as sort of an escalation, right? And so people in the crowd get agitated when they see the officers in their protective gear. When you talk to the officers, they say, we really need that as a defensive measure because people were throwing things at us, and there were officers who were injured in that process. And so when people in the crowd then do different things that to sort of adjust to that, the officers feel like the crowd is being aggressive, whereas when you talk to the protesters, they were saying we were doing that for our safety. So in essence, both sides were talking about being protective, but both sides were interpreted by the other as being aggressive. And so I do think in that moment that you described, which happened in late June, where there was a group of protesters who had come to the Capitol late at night. Keep in mind, there had already been a small group that had started a fire inside the city and county building. So tensions were quite high. And that was a moment where there was a communication breakthrough, right? Where it was, we're just staring at each other. Is this going to escalate, or are we going to find a way to connect kind of as people? And I think that officer was able to kind of negotiate with the group and say, we don't want this to escalate. What can we do to work this through? And the people that he spoke to in the crowd responded to that human interaction in a way that had not been possible earlier in earlier protests. So that was a moment that we really spent a lot of time looking at to try and figure out what made it successful when other moments we hadn't had that success. It was a very useful learning moment.
Chief Barnes, you mentioned one of the sort of the pillars of these recommendations is trust and legitimacy, which obviously is a years-long process, probably, right? You've been in your position now only how many months? 10 months? Not even 10 months.
10 months. 10 months. Yes.
Yeah, okay, 10 months. Yeah, since February. So, how's that going? How are you doing in terms of connecting with community, building some trust in yourself and in the department?
I think there's some things that you can point to that says, things are getting better. And there's some things that you can point to that says that things are not, right? And so, trust is like a bank account. You put some in and then something happens. We've had some things that have, quite frankly, taken out of that bank account of trust. But, things I can point to specifically is, being invited by the community to watch the Derek Chauvin verdict and being involved in those conversations. I did a press conference prior to that verdict. I had plenty of members of the community that came out, that spoke, that stood along with me and other law enforcement partners from around Dane County to basically say we want peaceful protest in the event this verdict doesn't come back in the way that we think it should be from a justice standpoint. But we're working every day. Our summer strategic plans were very successful in that we got back to some of that basic foot patrol work that we know through research improved citizen satisfaction in police services as well as police satisfaction. We know that going back in person to community meetings is really good for us. It gives us an opportunity to work hand in hand. But then there are some things that, quite frankly, we could have handled or could have done better. But I think that we're in a much better place than we were in 2020, and we're certainly moving forward, trying to build on things one step at a time.
Mm-hmm. So, can we talk a little bit about the process for this report? And we'll have this report. It's 132 pages. It's available to download as a PDF on the police department's website, and we'll also have it on Madison365.org for you. But let's talk a little bit about the process of this. You Dr. Holloway, you looked at just hours and hundreds of hours of video, hundreds, maybe even thousands of documents. You talked to, I think you said 50 police officers. And then you also mentioned a stakeholder group. Can you talk about who that stakeholder group was and how those folks were kind of selected or invited to participate?
Yeah, so the department, when you do one of these reports, what you try to do is get as many diverse perspectives from participants in the events as possible, because you really want to understand why people who were participating in the events did the things they did. What were they thinking about? What were they seeing? What were they worried about? What was influencing their actions? Because those are the things that then combined to lead to these undesired outcomes, which in this case are, violence against protesters, violence against police, property damage, et cetera.
Sure.
And so the department went around to various contacts in the community, and we tried to get as broad perspectives as we could from different community members. And so we had a stakeholder group, and the list is in the report of a variety of people. So people both participating from the various law enforcement agencies that were there, and then a substantial number of community representatives that themselves have different perspectives. Because of course, when we talk about, the crowd, it's not like that's a single uniform thing. That's a group of people who have varying perspectives and experiences. And so we tried to maximize that as much as we could. And then added to that by having the ability for public comment on a either declared, named, or anonymous basis, so that we could get as many people from the community participating and get all those perspectives as possible.
Yeah, and all those comments, by the way, are in the report, and some of them are
correct.
Some of them are not. Some of them are very frank, and some of them are frankly misinformed, honestly. But so I'm looking at the list of participants, and I do see some community organizations represented: Urban League, Nehemiah Center, Centro Hispano, Boys and Girls Club. What I don't see are any of the organizations who actually organize a protest. Freedom Inc., Freedom 350, Democratic Socialists, those folks. Were they invited and declined to participate, or do we just not have good contacts among those organizations?
I think there's a variety of reasons why people chose to participate, didn't choose to participate. And, I don't know individual answers to that question, except to say that this was a time-intensive process as well. Mm-hmm. And so, we did talk about some of the facts that there certainly were people in the community who opted not to participate. Some of that may have been, because of the philosophy of their relationship with the police. Sure. Some people may have not participated because of the timing. We did have some people who wanted to participate and then found that it was very emotional for them. Going back and reliving these was a really difficult thing for everybody involved, and so sometimes that would interfere as well. So there were a lot of different reasons for not participating, but we're very grateful for the people who did, and I think the report is made infinitely better by their participation.
Chief Barnes, I want to hit on before we, both of you, I appreciate your time very much. We'll wrap up here pretty soon, but one of the recommendations that comes through is to equip the police officers with body-worn cameras, which is an issue that's been talked about, been debated here in Madison for a couple of years at least, I think. One thing that I would anticipate the protesters would say is if you put body-worn cameras on police officers who are in a crowd like that, we're going to feel like that's surveillance of the crowd, right? So how would you respond to that? And sort of if you could take the temperature on where that debate is right now in terms of implementing body-worn cameras at some point in the near future, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so from the perspective of the report indicates that body-worn cameras would have aided in the evaluation of the officer's behavior. And that's the only thing that we're saying in regards to the report. What I'm saying is that I do think that body-worn cameras are an important tool to help me and others evaluate officer performance or to mitigate a complaint. It saves time, which saves money, which adds value to our community. I'll also say that where can you go that you think you're not on camera?
Right.
And so certainly,
fair enough.
Yeah, and certainly, the surveillance, if you understand that you're on camera, if the officers clearly demonstrate that, we let our public know. I don't think that that's going to be a shock to anyone. Certainly, there were footage that was used during this evaluation that was cell phone footage that was found by other. What's the difference, right? It's just a vantage point. But I believe that the next step in the process is to complete the body-worn camera pilot. And what that incorporates is I have to go to city council. I have to ask them for permission to use the pre-allocated money in the capital budget to run a 90-day pilot in the North District. I would like to make that request soon and design a study and implement that study in the spring of 2022.
Okay. Well, keep us in the loop on that. We'll definitely want to, keep an eye on it and make sure folks are informed, which I understand that's your desire as well, I'm sure. Listen, I really appreciate your time, both of you. Anything else, any parting thoughts about this report and what comes next?
No, my only parting thought is to thank Professor Holloway, to thank Assistant Chief Valenta, Captain Ty, the stakeholder group, and the community for allowing us to engage in this process, understanding that this was voluntary. No one made us or told us to do this. This is part of our core values, part of the Madison method of continuous improvement. And when Chief Wall began this process, there's only one research question: how can we improve? And I think this report certainly answers that question.
All right. Well, Dr. John Holloway, Chief Shon Barnes, really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There we go. I'm unmuted now. Appreciate Shon Barnes and Dr. Holloway. You'll notice that they did not actually answer my question, but whether those protest organizers were invited to participate. I don't know that this report would have changed much with, Em Adams from Freedom Inc. or Brandon Grayson or any of those folks that, participating. But that's twice now that I've asked that question and they've just dodged it, whether or not those folks were even invited. So I'm going to be reaching out to them tonight and figure out if that, if the protest organizers were actually engaged in this report process. I doubt that they were. So that's all I have for you today. I got to hop off. Have a wonderful evening. We'll be back here. We'll have that story up for you in the morning. We'll have some more information on that. And we'll be back tomorrow with more COVID numbers, more news for you right about the same time tomorrow. So until then, have a wonderful evening. We'll see you soon.
This is 365 Media.